Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 38 of the Future of Work show, where we discuss ideas around management, business, organizations, leadership, technology that are going to be helpful for all of us as we build the organizations of the future. And I have a very special guest with me today, Jocelyn Davis. Jocelyn, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
You know, Jocelyn, I have been reading your work for many years, and your model on strategic speed, before we even start talking about anything else, is so helpful. In fact, we teach it as part of a course we do on, how to manage in a hybrid workplace. When we speak to managers about, what are good ways to get aligned, we use your model of strategic speed. So, thanks for being a great influence for all of us.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear. Strategic Speed was my first book, and I'm just delighted that it's still out there and helping people.
It is. It's very, 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 very helpful, actually. I love the succinct way in which it just clarifies for managers what they need to do to get a team together. So I really found that very, very helpful. Of course, today you're here as the author of 3 nonfiction books and 1 fiction book. So for those of you who don't know Jocelyn, she's the author of 3 nonfiction books. Strategic Speed, as she said, was her first book. And then she's also written The Greats on Leadership, The Art of Quiet Influence, which is actually going to be the book that we're going to be talking about today. And then a novel, The Age of Kali. So Jocelyn, I have to ask you before we start, what got you interested in writing a novel? And what got you interested in writing a novel with some inspiration from India, shall I say?
Yes, indeed. So what got me started on writing a novel was that I had written The Art of Quiet Influence, which we're going to talk about, which really developed out of a master's program that I took on Eastern classics, which is the literature and philosophy of India, China, and Japan. And in that program, we read part of, not all of, the Mahabharata. And I was so just fascinated and inspired by that wonderful epic. But at the same time, somebody in our class made a comment that made me sort of think, I wonder if there's a way to think about this whole wonderful legend and work of literature differently, and try to bring out some of the more marginalized voices, so the women in particular. So I thought that I might, and I've always loved books that take a more inclusive view, shall we say, of great works of literature, and often a sort of a topsy-turvying, turning upside down of a great work of literature. I've always loved that kind of thing. So I thought maybe I could do that or try that with a piece of the Mahabharata. So that's what The Age of Kali is. It's my attempt to reimagine the Mahabharata, but bringing forth some of the voices and perspectives that are not so prominent in the original.
That's such an interesting perspective, Jocelyn. Can I ask you what got you interested in, works of the East? Because, you refer to them in the program that you taught. Of course, the entire book, The Art of Quiet Influence, is about 12 sages of the East. So what is it that, in your life connected you with some of these writings?
Yeah, so I grew up in a foreign service family. My father was a diplomat. And so when I was growing up, I lived not ever in India, although I would love to visit someday, but in Southeast Asia and in East Africa and in the British Caribbean. So I just interacted with many different cultures growing up, and have always been interested in exploring cultures outside the West, shall we say. So when I left my previous career, which was working for a company that did leadership and sales training, so in the corporate training industry, I thought, well, can I sort of go back to my roots, so to speak, and start studying some of these other cultures and their literature and their philosophy. And fortunately, My husband teaches at a college, St. John's College here in Santa Fe, and they offer a program in Eastern Classics, which I could attend for free since I was a spouse. So I thought, well, it's right here. Why not take advantage of it? So that's what I did a number of years ago. As I got into that program, took that course, and out of that, or partly out of that, came the Art of Quiet Influence.
Your background in literature just sort of shines through all of this. You can just tell that here's someone who's looking at it from a different perspective. It's not the typical, management modeling. In the art of strategic speed, which I love, but is still, fairly management framework oriented. And, certainly the art of quiet influences is much more discursive, in the way it is written itself. So can I ask you, you've spoken about 12 sages of the East. I'd love to understand from you what got you interested in, writing a book like this. And, you've connected their style of influencing with sort of quiet style of influencing. So I'd love to hear your thoughts around, one, what you see as the role of quiet influencing as a style, and why you chose the 12 Eastern sages as sort of role models for, a piece of it.
Yeah, so the book that I wrote prior to The Art of Quiet Influence, called The Greats on Leadership, that was my first book that brought in classic literature and philosophy as a way to understand leadership, which is always something that I've been interested in, sort of bringing those two worlds together, the world of classic literature and the world of business or leadership. And in that book, I talked about 4 levels of leaders and tried to look at leadership not through a hierarchical lens or a positional lens, but rather looking at leadership in terms of the impact that one has. So I talked about these 4 levels of leaders, and the highest level is what I called the mainspring leader, the mainspring. And the mainspring, as you know, is the piece in a watch or a clock that moves all the other pieces, but is unseen, is sort of in the background. So the mainspring leader is the person whose impact is greater than anyone else's, and yet is really sort of in the background, leading from behind or leading from the side, as you might say. So that was how I ended The Greats on Leadership, that book. And then I thought, okay, so what I really want to do next is explore this idea of the mainspring leader and how he or she can really have impact without positional authority. So that was then the sort of seed that led to The Art of Quiet Influence. And partly because I had written about Western thinkers in the previous book, and I had taken this master's course in Eastern Classics, I thought, I wonder if I can bring in the Eastern perspective in this book. And it turned out to be just a very natural fit, because the perspective in most Eastern philosophy, that is the philosophy of India, China, Japan, is much more, or I should say, much less individualistic than the Western view. So, I mean, these are broad generalizations, and so I don't want to stereotype, but it is true that cultures of the East and the thinkers of the East tend to think in a more relational way, more emphasis on the community, more emphasis on sort of the whole, rather than the individuals, which is and individual transactions, which is more of a Western way of seeing the world. So it turned out to be a very natural fit, and I was able to take a number of the sages that we had studied in the Eastern Classics program and combine them with this idea of quiet influence, that is, leading without authority, and bring them together in a very natural way.
And I noticed that you had, I think, 4 from India, right? Yoga, Vashistha, inspiration from the Mahabharata, Mahatma Gandhi, and Gautam Buddha.
Yes. Yes.
And in some ways, they're like spiritual leaders, philosophers, not leaders in the traditional organizational sense, but much more in terms of, getting people to think of the world itself differently.
Exactly. Yes. And one of the things I say in the book is that what I'm not doing is necessarily holding up these thinkers as role models personally, because in their lives they all had, they were human beings. They had flaws. They had, it's not necessarily that we want to emulate everything they did, but what they wrote about is just so filled with wisdom for leaders, or for anybody really. So what I'm writing about in The Art of Quiet Influence is what they had to say about how you can be an effective leader when you do not have positional authority.
I love the way, Jocelyn, that you speak about different practices, and you've got these 12 basic practices, and you speak about how they evolve based on the group's development stage. Right. Could you tell us a little bit more about, your thoughts around why these practices evolve, how they evolve, how do they change over the course of the group's lifespan?
Sure. Yeah. So this is one of the seminal ideas in team leadership that began in really in the 1980s, when people in business started to talk about teamwork. And Bruce Tuckman is, who many of your listeners may have heard of, came up with a model for team development that was very influential. And it was the model was called forming, storming, norming, performing. That sort of opened people's eyes to, oh yeah, there's a process by which teams come together, and we need to manage that process and be aware of it. So I found this very, very powerful idea. And at the company that I worked for many decades, called the Forum Corporation, we had our own version of that model that was part of the research that we had done on influence, this idea of lateral leadership, or leadership without authority. And so our version was membership, control, cohesion. But the basic idea is just that when a team starts out, you have to pay attention to this idea of belonging or membership, or bringing people together. And this is a step that so many leaders and team leaders just ignore. They want to get right to the work, and so they jump in and it's like, okay, everybody, let's just get going. So that membership phase is where I talk about my first core leadership practice, which is inviting participation. And I talk about how you really need to take the time up front to invite people in, to make them feel that they're truly members of a group. And that time that you take and that effort that you put in will have great payoff later on when you run into the inevitable problems. So in the second phase, that's when these struggles usually come up. In the second phase, which is the control phase, is where I talk about the second core practice, which is to share power. Mm-hmm. So you invite participation. Then in the second phase, you really need to pay attention to sharing power, because that's when the power struggles are likely to occur most and be most damaging. So the effective quiet influencer understands how to share power, how to help other people share power, so that everybody feels that they're on a level playing field, and everybody feels that they have influence and something to contribute. And then the final phase, which I call performance, the performing phase from Bruce Tuckman's model, is where you really need to aid progress. That's the third core influence practice I talk about, is aiding progress. And the main mistake that leaders often make in this phase is that they either start micromanaging because they're worried that we're not getting things done, we're not finished yet, we've got to hurry up, or they abandon the team and they say, okay, well, we're all done, so on to the next thing, and mission accomplished. So in aiding progress, what I talk about there is that practice is how to balance those two, to neither micromanage nor abandon, but to stay appropriately involved and helping the team move their work forward.
Makes a lot of sense. But let me ask you, Jocelyn, are there some of these practices that become particularly relevant today, given that in many parts of the world, a large number of people are still working remotely? So do you see some of these practices as being especially important in today's context?
Yeah, so that's a great question. My initial reaction is to say all of them, of course, because I actually, people often think that remote work is very different from in-person work, and in fact, it really isn't that different as a leader to work remotely than it is to work face-to-face. It's just you have to be even more aware of the need to use these practices that are about leading without positional authority, because if you're not there in person, that takes away sort of one more crutch that leaders can sometimes use, poor leaders really use, to intimidate or dominate or try to sort of say, well, I'm the boss, and so you have to do what I say. When you're remote, that in-person bossiness is taken away. So you have to be even better at some of these practices. But one practice that I will mention, and I think it would be of special interest to your listeners, because I talk about Mahatma Gandhi as he's the sage that I use to talk about this particular practice, is I call it ruling yourself. So it's managing your own emotions and behavior. And in a way, this is the sort of underlying deepest practice, if you will, of the art of quiet influence, because we can spend all day trying to influence other people, but as the Buddha said, better than 1,000 victories over 1,000 enemies is victory over one person, yourself. That is the hardest person to have so-called victory over, is yourself. So in that practice, managing your own emotions and behavior is, I think, the most difficult practice. One of the examples that I use in that, one of the stories that I tell in that chapter, is about Peter Drucker, who was a great management thinker, and he was invited in to speak to General Motors at a time when the Japanese the Japanese car companies were really just destroying the American car companies. And so the leader, the CEO of General Motors in the United States, invited in Peter Drucker to speak to all of his employees, his senior managers, about Drucker's ideas, which were very geared towards being a non-positional leader.
Yes.
And so Drucker arrived, and the CEO was on stage, and he gave the introduction and said, here's Peter Drucker, and I'd like you all to listen very carefully to him. He's going to give you some good lessons. And then the CEO walked off the stage, and Drucker looked at him and said, where are you going? And the CEO said, oh, well, I'm sorry, I have a meeting to go to, and I'm going to leave these people in your good hands. And Drucker said, well, if you leave, I'm leaving, because I'm not talking to these people without you here, because you're the one who needs to hear the message most of all. And so there was this extremely awkward moment where the CEO said, "Oh, okay." And so a chair was brought out for him, and he sat there on the stage and listened to the whole thing. But beyond that sort of, awkward moment, the point that Drucker was really trying to make was that, look, you guys can blame the Japanese all you want and talk about how, you're going to, beat them in the market. But you need to look at yourselves. Each one of you needs to look at yourselves as a leader. And starting with you, Mr. CEO, you need to look at yourself. And that it was a turning point for General Motors.
Wow.
That helped them.
Quite a story.
Yeah.
Jocelyn, can I ask you this? Because, this is a question that I think anyone who works in the leadership field sort of at least ponders over. So much of our leadership literature and so much of the leadership conversation is about what a leader does with the outside world. And you sort of, you don't, cover it in too much detail, but all the sages that you've chosen are, they're not just regular people, right? They're people who've done considerable work on themselves and have, sort of are, more evolved, for lack of a better word. Certainly, many of them are directly spiritual leaders, but even the others are, they're sort of evolved human beings. So what do you think is the role of working on yourself as a leader before you begin to even think about, what you're expressing or how you're connecting with the outside world?
Yeah. Yes. One of the quotes that I love is from the Bhagavad Gita, that I quote from it in the first few pages of the book, where Krishna says, "Rest established in the self. Rest established in the self." And that I think is quiet influence in a nutshell, really, because as I said before, you can spend all your time kind of directing your energy outward, trying to control others, but it's far more influential in a way to be the kind of person that, to use the words of one of my interviewees, who I modern day leaders who I interviewed for this book, he said, it's like being a ship in a storm. If you have the even keel, if you are the ship that can ride out the storm and can have that sense of calm, then people want to be around that. That is enormously influential because people sense that you are the even keel, the calm in the storm, and they will come to you for advice, for leadership, because they sense that you've got that, you rest established in the self, and they want that too. So I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah.
Yeah. And in fact, I'm going to connect this to the future of work itself. The fact that we're entering a time of tremendous change, external change, led by exponential technologies, globalization, and of course, there is the whole third force of climate change. So in this world, do you see 2 or 3 of these practices as being especially relevant for leaders of organizations from here on?
Yeah. Well, really, the whole concept of quiet influence, of this idea of leading without coercion, is just, I think, is the future of leadership, because for many decades now, we've been moving to flatter organizations. So the whole origin of this idea of lateral leadership or influence without authority began in the late 70s, early 80s, when organizations began to realize that we can't work in these silos anymore. These sort of big vertical stacks, hierarchical, where the information and guidance just moves vertically up and down. We have to be able to work across. So ever since then, organizations have been becoming flatter, more team-like, more remote, more spread out, more intercultural, more inclusive. And all of that means that the old model of I am the boss and you do what I say just does not work at all. And there's just, I give multiple examples in the book of people who try, including myself, who have tried to, or I should say, have made the mistake of thinking that authority is the same as power. They think that just because I have the leader's hat on, I have the authority to tell you what to do, so I'll tell everybody what to do and they'll just do it. It has never happened, and these days and in the future, it's just going to be entirely ineffective. So we have to begin by understanding that authority is not the same as power. Real power is the ability to get work done with other people. And the key to true power, flat power or quiet power, is this ability to influence others without resorting to that issuing commands.
Jocelyn, do you see a connection between, say, the art of quiet leadership and introversion or extroversion? Is there?
Yes, I do. That's a great question. I think that introverts, like me, are going to, they take very naturally to many of these concepts of quiet influence. The idea of not needing to be loud in order to be a leader, not needing to be aggressive or bossy, but rather being able to again rest established in the self, to have that sense of quiet confidence, quiet immovability in a way, not in the sense of being inflexible, but just knowing who you are, what you're about, and being able to convey that to others. I'll share, if I may, just the very quick story that opens the book about two tennis players, the famous or infamous John McEnroe and Bjorn Borg. And there was this incident where McEnroe was famous for his tantrums, and he would just throw his racket and abuse the officials and everything. And there was this one match when the two of them, McEnroe and Borg, were playing, and McEnroe was just acting up and going nutty. And Bjorn Borg walked up to the net and beckoned him. He said, "Come here." And McEnroe says, I thought, oh no, he's gonna yell at me. He's gonna tell me to shut up. But instead, Borg he put his arm around McEnroe's shoulders and he said, "It's okay. Just relax. It's a great match. It's okay." And McEnroe said that was this turning point for him, because he said he realized that it didn't matter. He didn't need to worry about the linesmen or the crowd or the officials or anything. As long as we could keep lifting our game, it was okay. So it changed the whole perspective. I know, I love it. And it wasn't that Borg lectured him or told him what to do or yelled at him or anything. He just said, "It's okay. It's a great game." And that changed changed McEnroe's whole view of himself in the game.
That's a beautiful story. Before we close, Jocelyn, one last question. Are there 2 or 3 of these practices that you would recommend many leaders, aspiring leaders, follow because you found them to be especially effective? Of the 12, are there 2 or 3 favorites you have?
Yeah, they're all my favorite, but it's like which is your favorite child? Well, they're all my favorites. The one that I will say my readers have cited over and over as their favorite is the one about converting adversaries to allies, which is in chapter 5, and the example that I use there is from the Mahabharata. Actually, it's the story of Princess Savitri, and how she made an ally out of Yama, the god of death, and got him to bring her husband back from the dead. And it's a wonderful story. But the reason that my readers, I think, love that particular practice so much is that I talk about how to understand the difference between a friend and an ally and a foe and an adversary. And the common mistake that many of us make is thinking that somebody is either a friend or a foe, a friend or an enemy. And we don't realize that, in fact, most people, they're not friends, they're not enemies, they're either an ally or an adversary. And the big difference there, and the good news there, is that allies and adversaries, that's a temporary or conditional state. Friends and enemies are, friends and enemies forever, basically, or they're very
longer positions.
They're locked in, yeah. But if you recognize that somebody who seems to be an enemy is actually just an adversary, which means that their interests are not aligned with yours. And if you can figure out a way to align your and their interests, then you can very quickly switch that person who you thought was an enemy, you can switch them from being an adversary to being an ally. And that's one of the most sort of powerful and tactical ways that there is to exercise influence, is by realizing that somebody is, this person is just an adversary, and I can switch them to being an ally.
It's a very good one.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, thank you, Jocelyn. It was such a pleasure speaking to you about the art of quiet influence. And I have to share, one of the reasons why I thought this would make such a good topic of discussion is that I, like you, also believe that the future belongs to a much quieter style of leadership. And that's simply because we are going to be entering an era where there is so it's going to become especially important for someone to be, that centered leader who can really understand what's happening all around and then create the internal circumstances and conditions that allow the entire, group or team or organization to come together and find good solutions. And that does require a different style of leadership from, authority or command and control based, which works far better when the outside world isn't changing quite as much. So you do need a different style of leadership. So I absolutely agree with you. I think the future of work demands a newer style of leadership, and one that is far more collaborative and far more centered than anything that we've seen in the past. I love the fact that in your book, you've selected these 12 great sages, but there's that commonality of, they're all sort of evolved people. So they're spreading the calm almost, So there's this whole, wherever they go. So, holding the center, spreading the calm, and, sort of being very wise about what they do. So there's that whole non-reactivity in, all your practices, very proactive and very thoughtful leadership. Which I thought was, which makes a lot of sense for an era where so much is going to be changing. So I thought that would be really helpful to all our listeners. Thank you so much for joining us, Jocelyn.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure talking with you.